Welcome back, virtual circuit riders. We want to continue the story of Methodism's Western mission and expansion. A very interesting story of Native American encounter, very early in the Western expansion of Methodism, occurred in the Pacific Northwest, and the story shed some light on the earliest phase of Methodist expansion to the coast, Pacific coast. Flathead and Napier leaders of the Native American peoples from the Pacific Northwest had encountered a number of American, mostly fur trappers in the Pacific Northwest, beginning to push into the area before America had claimed title to the Pacific Northwest or had claimed territorial rights there. It was an area of contested rights between Great Britain on the Canadian side and America. So during the encounter, the Native Americans inquired about the religion of the trappers in discussion, and the trappers would begin to talk about the Great Book that spoke about God and perhaps the Great Spirit, trying to make connections with the Native American ideas. They asked to see this Great Book, in which case the fur trappers said, "Well, we don't have one with us," and then pointing them back eastward. And so a number of leading men from these native peoples began a long journey from the Oregon Territory back to St. Louis, to one of the military forts in St. Louis, seeking to find out more about this great religion and this great book in particular. In finding a U.S. military fort there in St. Louis, the leader on post happened to be a United Methodist who began to show them this great book. And the military officer publicized this most remarkable inquiry from the Native Americans, and it was picked up in the Methodist press and indeed the press in general. And so the story of the Native Americans goes forth to Methodism, at which point the mission board decided through this publicized event to begin a mission, the first Methodist mission on the Pacific Northwest in 1833. Unfortunately, the Native Americans exposed on the journey to various diseases of the American population, the white population, the settlers, the colonial settlers, were unable to sustain life, and they succumbed to death before they could make it back to Oregon. Jason Lee, this man here, was sent by the mission board, and the first Methodist mission was begun in Oregon. Theologically, often Methodist bodies believed that the prevenient grace, the grace that comes before justifying grace by faith, that the Spirit of God was already at work in culture and in history, providentially among peoples before they could even articulate faith. And so this was an example where prevenient grace was seen in the call to understand the great book by the Native Americans. And so Methodists mounted this movement. And it's in this Western expansion that we see maverick, sometimes eccentric Methodist missionaries chasing prevenient grace over the next hill. The notion of prevenient grace, that God is already at work over the next horizon. We simply must catch up to God and point to the presence of God. So seeking resettled native populations in Oklahoma, or gold seekers on the western coast, or trying to simply compete with other Methodist groups, particularly Church Extension Society, of the North and the South after the Homestead Act of 1862 brought thousands of white settlers into Oklahoma, Nebraska, and other Midwest states. So a lot of upheaval in the post-Civil War period, a lot of resettlement, and the Methodists were there. So the Missionary Society of both the MEC and the MEC South re-employed the circuit rider after the Civil War, after the circuit riding that form had really succumbed to station charges. They transformed the circuit rider, resurrected him in this case, into the home missionary. And so the church extension societies and even home mission societies rapidly expanded in the Western expansion. The early Oregon mission was initially successful. Jason Lee leads a party of settlers out the Oregon Trail, and the first permanent settlement of white Americans occurs in the present-day Willamette Valley, in present near Salem, Oregon, the capital of Oregon. Jason Lee and the Methodist Mission, which you can see here, there's a state park there dedicated to the First Methodist Mission. This Methodist Mission was the first permanent settlement, and so Oregon history traces its earliest origins to the circuit riders and to the Methodist Mission among the Native Americans. In fact, outside the courthouse in Salem, Oregon, the State House, there is a statue of the circuit rider, Jason Lee, and other Methodists who arrived there. So you can't really tell Oregon history without telling of the settlement brought by the Methodist Mission. The settlers from the Methodist Mission were able to claim the Oregon area for America, defeating the attempts of Great Britain to settle and to claim that as territory. Jason Lee's work required fundraising, and numerous times in his return back east to raise money, he fell afoul of the mission board, who had competing ideas on the way the mission should be run, and he was ultimately recalled, not before his wife died in Oregon. So the mission was not really a success until later, and you can see in this map here, the success of the mission would really be another 15 or so years later. You can see that a conference, these mission years in which a mission or a conference was first established, are these dates here. You can see Northern California, 1849, also Oregon. It'd be a few years later that Seattle and the Washington area would be one for the churches. We'll look at language conferences among immigrant populations in another period, but you can see the western states all had much later annual conferences. Arizona, 1880, that area, 1864 for the New Mexico area. These were all settled by the church extension societies and home mission board work. Home mission board work worked with the various immigrant populations, also with the Pacific Japanese Mission of 1900, Hawaiian Mission, 1905, Alaska, etc. You can see here that vigorous home mission work on the West Coast from the latter part of the 19th century. We'll look at immigrant work in another session. We've talked about the work of C.C. McCabe already, the John McCain, as it were, of church extension. His work grew out of the post-Civil War expansionistic northern church, which was able to economically leverage its relative wealth in the cities, raising $8.7 million at the 1866 centenary, which was held to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the foundation of the John Street Society there. So already within 100 years, Methodism is spreading and raising money for its church extensions all the way to the West Coast. And one of the most remarkable geographic expansions for a latecomer to religion within Christian history. The post-Civil War raised many questions about this Protestant so-called kingdom of America that agnostics such as the poet Robert Ingersoll saw in the Civil War the death of unified Protestant America, showed it for its lack of unity, and the Civil War itself as a sign of death. He wrote a poem, "The churches are dying out all over the land. They are struck with death," in the aftermath of the Civil War. C.C. McCabe was traveling on a train, presumably out west, to raise money on many of his speaking tours, talking about his work as a prisoner of war, a chaplain in the Civil War. And he stopped and was so struck by the agnostics' lines that the churches are dying, he stopped and got out of the train and wired the message, not with his cell phone, but with the telegraph at the point. "All hail the power of Jesus' name. We're building more than one Methodist church for every day in the year, and soon we'll make it 2 a day." He had this wired to Robert Ingersoll, and this "we're building 2 a day" became Methodism's Western church extension watchword, particularly among the northern branch. And of course, C.C. McCabe was elected bishop in 1896. His work really found great solidification in the Western apostles of Thomas Iliff and William Wesley Van Orsdale. C.C. McCabe's cousin was Mary was married to Thomas Iliff, and Iliff became the assistant secretary of the Home Mission and Church Extension Society, and his work in Montana, Utah, and Colorado, particularly his missionary work founding churches in the Denver area for close to 40 years, 38 years there, dedicated over 500 churches, particularly in Utah and Montana and Colorado. So he was able to raise money in connection with C.C. McCabe, and he is the namesake for which the Iliff School of Theology in Denver is named. The other great leader, William Wesley Van Orsdale, was also sent by a Church Extension Society and C.C. McCabe, sent to Montana in 1872. And during his almost 45, close to 50-year ministry, more than 50-year ministry there, Brother Van established 170 churches and really brought Methodism into Montana in his 47-year ministry. He was a popular figure. He would often come to the mining camps and the fur trading, cowboy herding camps, and he would offer to cook for them, and he would sing and entertain them and disciple and preach to them, and got to their hearts through their stomachs, as it were, and was considered one of the best loved men among the hardened men of that northwestern territory. He was popular also and friendly with the Blackfoot Native American peoples, and was adopted into their tribe or their people in 1915. He offered the inaugural prayer when Montana was taken into the United States in the early 20th century. And so the extraordinary western expansion of Methodism from sea to shining sea to the Canadian border of the Pacific Northwest, really within little more than 100 years, ushered in what scholars of American religion have called the 19th century the Methodist century because of its mission work to the West.